So good afternoon, everyone. It's Steve Bates, the CEO of the BIA. I'm joined by my colleague, Michael Warren. Michael.
Hello, everyone.
This is BIA Brexit, or as we now like to think of it, Future Trade Relationships webinar. It's my first one for a while. I know, Michael, you updated everybody at the end of January, but I'm not sure this community has heard from me in this format for quite some time, really since the turn of the year. So I think we've got a full agenda, and knowing how important webinars are becoming, they are, of course, corona-proof. We thought we'd make sure we've got a bumper pack for you today, so there's quite a lot going on. And to keep you awake and interacting, we've got audience polls happening throughout. So we are going to ask you to answer some questions. We're going to see whether you're still with us, whether you're awake at various points. So we thought we'd recap on the latest position and timelines, give you a sense of the UK and the EU's negotiating positions. I think it's important to evolve this discussion to understand that the UK is also, in some sense, trying to do a parallel deal with the US, and we'll talk about that, and then look at how we might move this discussion forward through the year. I know some of you have been stalwart fans of this series ever since it began 3 years ago. Perhaps if you're new, we hope you'll get in the next 40 minutes or so is insight into the process, and we're keen to understand what you need as members going forward through 2021. We'll also take questions at the end, so do type them into the questions function if you're interested. Michael, I'm going to hand over to you for the latest news.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to see so many people on the webinar today. It's a bumper turnout, isn't it? So, hi, everyone. Just a quick kind of roundup of where we got to. I mean, actually, quite a lot has happened since we had our last webinar at the end of January. It felt like at the end of last year, we were waiting a long time for clarity on things, and all of a sudden, quite a lot of things have come into view. So what has happened? Well, middle of February, there was the reshuffle. It wasn't quite a Valentine's Day massacre, was it, Steve?
No.
But we did lose our Chancellor, which maybe some people might have said was a little bit careless. And I think what's interesting is that I think what we saw was that a number of key positions actually shifting over to what you might call kind of the Prime Minister's sort of Brexit crew. I think generally speaking, it was sort of observed that a lot of the jobs sort of drifted towards maybe some of the more pro-Brexit, the sort of the traditional Brexit crew that had been with Boris on sort of the Leave journey. So that was interesting. I think creates a slightly different political dynamic for this whole agenda, which we'll talk about as we go through the deck, I think. Okay, so, and then we had both the EU and the UK negotiating mandates were published. Actually, technically speaking, the UK's isn't a mandate. The EU has a mandate because it's negotiating on behalf of member states. The UK's are just the UK government's objectives. So they were published last week. We've got some analysis on those in a second. And they're off and running. So first round of negotiations have actually been taking place this week. And that's actually just ended. They were due to wrap up at about 11 o'clock this morning, I think. We haven't heard.
Well, we have. I've got.
Have you heard?
Yeah, no, there is a. It says here that Barnier says so. Michel Barnier, the guy in the blue suit in the right of this picture next to the EU flag, says 4 major points of divergence. That there are many divergences, and there are some serious divergences, which is probably quite natural in the first round of negotiations. And he says they are level playing field, criminal justice, law enforcement, governance, and fishing. So. We'll touch on those as we go through.
Well, absolutely, and yeah, I mean that's the key thing, isn't it? At this stage, it's really kind of talks about talks, and it seems to me that they were just kind of working out where the battle lines were going to be drawn for that first round. And then the last point on that slide is just that this week, UK government published finally its objectives for the US deal, and we'll go into that a bit later on as well. Just a quick reminder. I mean, I went through this in the last webinar, but we're still seeing a few kind of instances of a kind of lack of clarity of what the transition period means. So remember, the government saying Brexit is done. In fact, they're not actually allowing MPs to talk about Brexit anymore. We saw a leak, which the Huffington Post ran, didn't they, about the new lexicon for Brexit. And of course, Brexit is no longer something they want to talk about. That's history now. But for the transition period, at least, it's a standstill period for the most part. Well, I went through all the run through all of the points because we covered it last time, but most of the stuff that's relevant to businesses in our sector stays the same for the year ahead. The points that are different are that the UK is no longer represented in EU institutions and bodies, and the MHRA is no longer really taking part in any of the regulatory network meetings, although still technically it could be invited in, it isn't being as it stands. The points on the right-hand side there, just the clarity that for the most part, regulatory processes stay the same until the 31st of December.
And you've done a nice graphic here.
Well, yeah, people have seen the timeline before. There's just a couple of things on here to kind of point out that are different. Well, the first thing is I've just got a flag here on how long it is to go to the end of the year. So we're 310 days and counting to 31st of December, Steve. I'm sure those days will go, I don't know, are they going to go quickly or slowly? I'm not sure. The mandates have been published. The negotiations are underway. Just at the bottom there on the left-hand side, it's worth noting that the government has quietly committed to launching a consultation on the impact of that EU negotiating objectives document. So we're expecting that sometime in March, which will be an opportunity for us to kind of feed in our thoughts about what this could mean. So that's the first time they're committed to actually doing any kind of impact assessment. You remember the kind of the political debate on this is that, you know, they've been booting into long grass questions about what impact this could have on the UK economy. So hopefully that's coming to focus now. The other thing to flag on here is that June moment. So when the UK government published its negotiating objectives last week, they had this section called timing and pace of the negotiations, where they very clearly flagged the importance of June, which is the date that the political declaration says there's going to be a high-level meeting, a sort of a stock take meeting. And this is the point at which Boris really wants to see substantive progress on the negotiations and the chance of a deal being finalised in September. And if they don't see that at that stage, it looks like they're going to start substantive preparations for what they're calling the Australia-style WTO
and that's
agreement.
That's what I would remember as no deal planning in old language, in old money. Sorry to be so 2019 about it. So we have to call that trading on Australian terms now, don't we?
Exactly. That's it, I think, on that slide, Steve.
Time for a poll.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get a sense of, do you think the UK and the EU will get a deal done? Will they agree a free trade agreement before the 31st of December? So we asked this before, whether you thought there would be deal or no deal. I suppose it's a similar question. Do you think that there will be a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU agreed so that we can work towards that before the 31st of December this year? Thank you very much. We've got half of you have voted. We're going to give it 30 seconds. We're at 20 seconds. 79% of you have voted. Please come on. We're not going to hold you to this. It's just for fun. 83% have voted. Last 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go. And the answers here is 66% think we won't have a deal, and 34% think that we will have a deal. Is that right?
Are we reading that?
Yep, we're reading the right one. So
twice as 2 to 1. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're 2 to 1 in that you don't think a deal's going to be done. Let's see how that moves as we go through the year. Thank you very much for your input. And just for a second poll, we'll keep your fingers on the buzzers. Do you think the UK and the USA will agree a free trade deal before the 31st of December? There's ambitious plans from the government, the UK government, to do a deal. We'll talk about this later, but just a quick census. Do you think a deal will get done? Again, another 30 seconds on this. Thank you. You're being faster this time. 3/4 of you have voted within the first 10 seconds. So if we get to 90%, I will close it within this. We're at 85%. Come on, the last few. 8 seconds to go. Am I going to get above 86% turnout? What, this is almost Putin-esque in its turnout, isn't it? There we go. 88% have voted. 71% no. 29% yes. So I think that's useful for us, and I think hopefully that colours the discussion as we go forward. We're now going to talk a little bit about negotiating positions. So negotiations are underway, and you found this amazing picture, Michael.
Yeah, someone tweeted this out. This is the room that they've been doing negotiations in this week over in Brussels. I mean, it's quite astonishing, isn't it? Look at the size of that horseshoe and the distance between Barnier and Frost. I mean, how you get any kind of agreement on anything in that kind of setup is.
Oh, you're still on the other slide. Hang on, we've been told that we've got a problem. We are still on the back of the previous slide, so we are just going to sort that out for you. Hopefully somebody can tell us, yes, we are good. You're now seeing our funny picture, which is a very large horseshoe.
Just for the people on the phone, you should know that there's a whole host of people in the BIA office here dialing into our own webinar, but in the main office, and we're in a meeting room, which is good. It's reassuring, isn't it? We've got this kind of audience, Steve.
Yeah, no, it is good.
Anyway, where we have massive distance between the negotiators. The other thing to point out.
This isn't a coronavirus thing, is it? this was organised before coronavirus.
That is a good point, actually. I don't know I can't remember what the distance is. It
2 meters.
It's definitely more than 2
so
meters.
There's little chance of these, but they are shaking. They did shake hands.
Is it 2 meters in 10 minutes? Or
I think so. They've probably gone on for more than 10 minutes, and they're going to meet a lot over this schedule here. But I mean, I think anybody who's in business will know that that's the type of room that you get your deals done in, isn't it? You know, I mean, you know, that's. So this is, I think the point here is this is a formal process with all of this stuff going on.
Seriously, just to note that 5 rounds have been scheduled so far. That doesn't mean there are only going to be 5 rounds. So every 2 or 3 weeks, there was a debate between Brussels and London about how frequent these would be. I think UK wanted them to be more frequent, so they've sort of fudged it, and they've ended up with sort of either 2 or 3 weeks. Each lasting sort of Monday through Thursday, but yeah, more rounds could be scheduled. It's just they haven't put the actual dates in for subsequent rounds. This is basically the series that takes you up to that June high-level meeting.
Thank you. And you see here the EU negotiating side, a big team.
It's massive. It's just worth noting that on the UK side, they've actually only named, what is it, 4 people on the UK side. So there's David Frost, and then there's 2 civil servants, and then there's Oliver Lewis, who's part of the Vote Leave campaign as well, sort of as a deputy negotiator. But there's a sort of a stark contrast in terms of the size of the crew there. Anyway, so in terms of the EU's position on this, so this is just a quick summary of what the EU mandate says. So firstly, robust commitments on level playing field is what they want. They are very keen on a free trade agreement. They're looking for a comprehensive, ambitious deal. 0 tariff, 0 quota, in brackets 0 dumping, of course, is the mantra. Cooperation on customs and regulatory aspects to sort of smooth trade flows. Critically, they are very, very firm on fishing. So I think the French firmed up the EU mandate at the last minute, didn't they? So reciprocal access to fishing as per the existing arrangements, cooperation on digital trade, IP, procurement, mobility, transport and energy, and then law enforcement, judicial cooperation, foreign policy, security and defence, and critically set within an overall governance framework across all of those areas of cooperation. So remember, it's not just an FTA. The FTA is one part of the future relationship. The other parts, things like security, judicial, energy, those are sort of supplementary, but the EU wants to bind all of that together in one governance framework. And of course, that means, well, I'll come onto this in a subsequent slide, that it means that they get the right to take measures if it sees the UK breaching any of that. Whereas, of course, the UK wants the opposite. I'll talk about that more in a second.
And then we've seen a different sort of approach from the UK in the negotiation.
Well, yeah, of course, the UK is saying, isn't it, Steve, a Canada-style deal. This is the kind of the easy to remember kind of phrase. In some respects, you could say there's actually quite a, I mean, I can't remember which, was it, I can't remember which media ran this piece. I think the FT had a piece earlier in the week saying there's actually on quite a lot of areas, quite a lot of stuff that the UK and EU mandates share in common. So free trade agreement, no tariffs, no quotas, customs facilitation, modern rules of origin. That's all pretty close to what the EU is asking, mutual recognition on qualifications, high standards on IP, participation in European programs like Horizon. So far so good, so aligned, but critically, separate agreements for each part of the future relationship, not an overall governance mechanism. And you'll have heard this, of course, no role at all, no oversight role for the European Court of Justice. So this is the quote from Gove on the day, you know, a friendly cooperation between sovereign equals, our own laws that we have control of, our own rules. So that's where we ended up.
Thank you. And if I can just take people through, because I think this is probably at some distance to what I've been leading people to think might be where we might be going. And I just want to take you through why we're in a new reality and why I think we've got to somewhere which is not where we were led to believe we might be at the back end of last year. So I'm going to start with the political declaration in October 2019. And if you remember, this is the post-Boris taking over before the election, says that we're going to explore the possibility of cooperation of the EU, UK authorities with European agencies, union agencies such as the European Medicines Agency. And many of you will have been at the Bioscience Forum, where Health Secretary Matt Hancock came and told us this is our plan A, and it's consistent with the political declaration that was published today. And we tried to keep our ear close to the ground and find out what was going on as the government's thinking evolved. And then we kept close to it through the election period and into the new government. And then we saw statements on this in the Houses of Parliament during January. So here's a quote from Lord Duncan, who's Minister. These agencies, including the EMA, are clearly ones in which we would wish to see an active participation. But then, as Michael's alluded to, we saw the reshuffle with some quite big changes happening within it. We saw the Life Science Minister, Nicola Blackwood, who we've obviously had a strong relationship with, deciding to leave the government. Now is the right time for her for me to pursue new ventures, she said a couple of weeks ago. And Chris Skidmore, who was the Science Minister, also tweeted RIP, the Minister of Sciences, University, Science, Research and Innovation. So in a sense, all of these people and much of what they were saying have exited the government in the last couple of weeks, which has led to what we're seeing in the negotiating position. Any solution has to respect our reg line of no commitments to follow EU law and no acceptance of the ECJ. There are very limited options for third country membership of EU bodies, and we've been clear we'll be operating on the basis of existing precedents. So despite what we have been told consistently and the work that we have done over many years, it is clear that following the election and following the choice of the new government, the government has committed eyes wide open to a course where anything that includes the acceptance of the ECJ or anything that looks like continued close cooperation within the European system is not in the UK mandate. And I think that's a big change from where we were. So I think it's important that we mark this and be aware of this and realise Plan A is no longer on the table. I think what's also unclear, if you like, is exactly whether there is any space for any continued discussion of cooperation with EU bodies and agencies. There is potentially some space for where there is things in the narrowly defined areas in the interests of both sides. But it's interesting that there has already been perhaps a canary in the coal mine in the discussion around the EWRS system, the EU Early Warning and Response System, which is the EU system by which early warning and response to public health threats is organised. And the UK government has chosen to withdraw from that system. It's in line with the government's line and its negotiating objectives, which rule out the participation in the EU agencies. We've seen some talk in the press of this being a disagreement between the Department of Health on this and Number 10 on this, and particularly in the context of coronavirus, we've seen that reach the media. And it was interesting to see that Nicola Blackwood, the former minister who left the government at the reshuffle, staying very clearly on Sky News earlier in the week. My advice when I was a minister was that we should stay engaged with the EWRS system. A separate agreement on global health security, especially in the context of what's going on right now, would be entirely appropriate. So she's obviously convinced of the case of this type of continued close cooperation. The Prime Minister was asked about it in his press conference on coronavirus. Will the UK continue to access EWRS by Politico? He didn't actually answer that specific point. He said, we will continue to have global coordination as you would expect. So no commitment for Europe. And this question came up again in the House of Commons in the discussion of the Medicines Bill this week. The UK is open to exploring a cooperation between the EU and other specific narrowly defined areas when it is in the interest of both sides. And on matters of health security, it would be foolish not to, Joe Churchill, a junior minister in the Department of Health, said this week. So it's interesting to see where this discussion is, and you can see that there may be some some space here, but I think it's indicative of perhaps how we might see the discussion go, and the primacy the government, UK government at the moment, is putting on issues of sovereignty over perhaps some more pragmatic approaches around useful utility. But we'll see how it goes. We're at the beginning stages of this. I think one thing that we can be pleased about in the UK negotiating position is that there are specific provisions where I believe that there has been a sensible discussion and input from the industry around an annex on medicinal products, and I pay testament to BIA members who've worked very hard, and we've worked hard with the MHRA, the Office of Life Science and others, to make sure that an understanding of the absolute things that need to be maintained to enable the operation of our sector are put into the UK's ask. So they are asking for an annex on medicinal products, and that this should make things facilitate trade and support high levels of patient safety. And the detail of those are the types of things here. They are looking at commitments to cooperate on pharmacovigilance and develop comprehensive confidentiality agreements between regulators, like they have with the Swiss, US, and Canadian authorities. So I think there is this is important. I think it covers many of the things that we care about, and I think that this is vital that we'll stay on top of this. So despite the divergence, there is a cold hard reality in this annex, which should be important. Of course, this is a negotiating position. We don't know whether both sides will agree it, but we believe that there's continues to be a strong patient safety and benefit to the sector case for pretty much all of these points, and we'll continue to have this at the centre of where we're at. We touched a little bit on the bigger challenges. So remember, our stuff has to fit within an overall negotiation. And
I'll tell you what, Steve, it's very reassuring, having put this slide together over the last couple of days, that you're saying that Barnier agrees with us.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's no surprise to hear that state aid, governance, fishing, I think the other thing you mentioned was security, the big areas of dispute. The point on security is because the UK didn't put security into their negotiating objectives, whereas the EU have been very clear they want that to be part of the future relationship. And people are saying that it may well be the UK trying to play hardball and say, well, we might withdraw cooperation on security unless you give us what we want. So that's an interesting point of divergence. The other thing, state aid, governance and fishing, I think, you know, they're well documented, aren't they? So maybe we can, I don't know, in the interest of time, let's not go into this in too much detail.
So what have we been saying? Well, this is our take, and I'm interested in member feedback, additional member feedback on this. I've said publicly that, disappointingly for our sector, which had called for deep and close future relationship, the government's vision isn't as ambitious as we'd hoped for. We're glad to see the need to seek agreement in areas vital for the continued operation of the sector. We'll continue to work closely to make sure that the UK is a fantastically competitive place for biotech and for the benefits of patients in the broader economy. But we need to get ready for some changes, and we need some detail on what those are, particularly around Northern Ireland, and people probably need to get ready for that. So with that, I'm going to conclude on the EU-UK, but we're now going to talk a little bit about the US-UK trade deal, which has also moved quite rapidly. And the trading smoked salmon for Stetson hats negotiating objectives that the Prime Minister outlined only last week are quite important for us. And I've taken the time here with Michael to go through the detail of bits that are particularly important for us in terms of intellectual property and healthcare. I think it's slightly unusual here that you see a government position on a UK-US free trade agreement on intellectual property and healthcare make some points which you sort of think, why is this here? So if you look at the last paragraph here, restates the UK's continued commitment to Doha and TRIPS, and agreed flexibilities that support access to medicines, particularly during health emergencies in developing countries. I don't think the UK or the US are developing countries, but it's interesting that perhaps because of some of the discussion that's been had in the UK during the election and some of the write-ins from the lobby groups, from charities and other campaigning groups, this has made its way into the UK's objectives here. And you can see that it's essentially an argument here of balance between the UK government balances commitment to ensuring that patients have access to medicines and affordability with supporting a positive environment for the life sciences industry. So I think from our perspective, it's interesting to see that the UK government sees its trade objectives as a balancing act. We think, obviously, as a life sciences industry, that our major value is in the intellectual property generated here and then exported around the world, and high levels of intellectual property in other markets are vital for the benefit of the UK life science sector. So I think that this is an interesting approach to this. And if you look at the US position, they've looked to secure commitments to regulatory compatibility to facilitate US exports in key areas. They respect TRIPS, but don't go into the details of it as the way that the UK does. And they're looking for procedural fairness for pharmaceuticals and medicines devices standards to ensure government regulatory reimbursement regimes are transparent, provide procedural fairness and non-discriminatory, and provide full market access for US products. Now that, in some respects, means about how the process is nice work and things like that. None of these are unusual in a US position. They're the same as you would see in the US negotiating with many other markets. So what's our position on what the UK should be doing? Well, I think we understand that, we've seen challenges in the US ratification process when it comes to life sciences or intellectual property. So it's a shame the UK isn't a bit more front foot in its opening position. I suppose we think that a state-of-the-art IP trade deal between US and the UK could then become the basis on which other trade deals could be done. It would set a very strong precedent, and we've already seen that, and been part of the EU work, the UK is no longer seeking to participate in the Unified Patent Court, and some of the savings we would have got there in terms of enforcement have gone. So it would be good if we could have it really strong. Again, the early days here, we're making sure that we check in with colleagues in bio to make sure that there's an agreed industry approach. We're engaging with the Department of International Trade through their expert trade advice group, and we can see that if they're going to try and do this, time is tight because the US is obsessed, well, rightly focused on its own election timetable, which runs through this year. Hopefully, perhaps something we won't see in the UK this year. And I suppose the way that I've been starting to think about this differently, and I welcome your insight, and do email me if you think this is heading in the right direction or wrong direction, is if we are in a new world and we're thinking about this in the cold light of trade deals, what are the things that our sector would want from a trade deal? If in a sense, if we were dealing with Mars, it would be the same. I mean, the point being is any trade deal. Usually, I think the sense that I get from members is if there's tariffs, they need to be reduced. Well, actually, that's quite a low burden for us. There's bits at the edges, but essentially 0 for 0 works pretty well. In most parts of our sector, there are exceptions, and we should work towards them, but that would be an objective. We usually want to align or reduce regulatory burden or red tape, or harmonise or go to procedures like that. Is that happening, and is that being sought, and is that going to save us time, money and hassle? We usually want to improve IP protection in our sector because value is based on our IP, and are those trade deals going to improve IP protection? And there's quite a lot of technical IP protection in life sciences, and that's often handled in a specific chapter or in a pharmaceutical chapter of trade deal. Are we seeing that developing, and is that working for our sector? And then probably there's some things about ease of recruitment or retention of skilled workforce, or the recognition of certain skill sets and mutual recognition of qualifications and such like, which can also be good. So in a sense, I'm trying to group our bucket of objectives now in the new world of the we're going to be global Britain, striking great trade deals around the globe. These are sort of my sort of broad bucket objectives, and we imagine that we'll mark the scorecard as to whether they are improving, pluses for this for our sector or minuses for our sector. And you may have in your own minds an initial scorecard from the initial negotiating objectives as to where you'd put things on this, but I think this is the new framework I'm evolving for us to think about this, and I'd welcome your feedback as to whether this makes sense. Maybe we can just talk about how things might go through 2020 and into 2021, Michael.
Well, yeah, I mean, so much of this is contingent on where we get to in terms of the negotiations. But I suppose the key point that we just wanted to flag here is that certainly during transition, all of the the guidance on what happens during transition is up on our website now, and as government provides more detail, we'll keep updating that. The existing stuff we've got on there, like existing webinars, I think whilst they were done in the context of no deal, I mean, depending on where we get to in the negotiations, that could start to become quite useful again for the end of the year, couldn't it?
Well, and also if people are self-isolating or unable to travel and they have plenty of time to work from home in the next 6 weeks, then I would say that a quick revision on a couple of the no deal ones probably is not time wasted.
I'll give you a specific plug on the one around people, because none of that has changed. We had an expert from KPMG talk through that in quite a lot of detail, which is worth revisiting. The other thing just to flag here is the government's got a new checker tool, which you can log into and find the advice that's most specific to you as a business, depending on your circumstances. That's getting ready for 2021. So have a look at that if you've got a spare moment. I mean, this slide here, Steve, was really just about saying things could get quite fruity at the end of the year. I mean, there's been quite a lot of talk about blockades in Calais. Remember, the opening to Calais harbour is about 2 trawler lengths wide, isn't it? So it doesn't take much of a French protest.
I'm glad you know how long a trawler is.
Well, how long is a trawler, Steve? But what we see historically, I mean, it's not so many years back that we saw a whole load of trade union action among French fishermen, which basically brought the port to a standstill, and that could happen again pretty easily. So I suppose the key thing is here is, border delays are a significant possibility for 1st of January, and we've got to get ready for that. And the French aren't talking it down, that's for sure.
And I think this goes to the point that perhaps in the second half of the year, depending on how negotiations are going and taking the mood of the people on the webinar, you're not immensely confident that we'll be trucking towards a deal. We may well be in some sort of trading on Australian terms deal discussion, which might involve something that looks quite a lot like what we were doing ahead of no deal planning. So we'll see where we get to, but that's where we're thinking. I'm going to talk a little bit about looking the other way, not east from the UK to Calais, but west across the Irish Sea to Northern Ireland. And remember that the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed as part of the political declaration last November. We still don't really know how it's going to work. It's an agreement between the EU and the UK. There's lots of discussion here, unfortunately, about how that trade route will work, what the requirements on businesses will be, whether they're shipping through, how the regulatory environment will work, because the MHRA remain responsible, but it has to be part of the European single market. So I think that lots of questions remain here, and I've had the chance to go to Northern Ireland last week. You can see me sitting there with colleagues in Northern Ireland, and I think we had another lovely big table. We were scratching our heads around that one rather than trying to do a deal. If we're going to change this or make it operational, which we may have to do, there's loads of questions that are unresolved, loads of technical questions, and we've really been banging the drum and saying, look, we need an urgent technical working group of industry, regulators and health systems established so that everyone has enough time to plan, know what's going on and implement any changes. So that remains our position, but Northern Ireland remains a very significant headache.
All right, well, what do we know so far about preparing for the end of the year? I mean, there's some things which are pretty clear already. I mean, this clearly will firm up, as we said before, as the negotiations proceed, and we get a sense of what kind of environment we're looking at. But the things that we know so far, the stuff on, as I said earlier, the stuff on people hasn't changed. So EU citizens in the UK have until June 2021 to register for settled status or pre-settled status. And the numbers on that are looking good. A huge number of EU citizens have already registered. If your staff haven't already done that, they should get onto it. But of course, they've got until June next year to do that. The key thing to note is that if you're an employer looking to bring new EU citizens into the UK from the 1st of January, you're going to need to register to sponsor those employees, and there's a process you have to go through in registering with the Home Office to do that. Takes probably 4 to 6 weeks to get through that process, so don't leave that too late. Go and have a look on gov.uk, and get yourself applying for that if you think you're going to need to bring new people in from 1st of January. The other thing is perfectly clear, as Michael Gove has confirmed, there will be border frictions, irrespective of the type of deal, if any, that's done with the EU at the end of the year. So preparations are required there. The government's already advising you, if you haven't got one already, to apply for an economic operator number, an EORI number, and consider whether you need a customs agent, and to have a look at your EU supply chain and think what might happen if there were delays bringing things over or sending things back across the channel.
Yeah, I think that these are practical points that people can at the moment operate on against stuff that's known. So you can take action for your people. You can take action to prepare for. We're not quite sure of the nature of the customs regime yet, but there will be some form of customs regime. The bit of the customs regime we're very unclear on is what happens if you've got contacts into Northern Ireland or coming through or via the Republic of Ireland through Northern Ireland. So you may want to check that out. But perhaps if there was a priority area that you can actually do with confidence, I think the people stuff you can do with confidence. Regulatory stuff we have some clarity on, but not full clarity. Customs, we know that you need to get ready, and that may also involve inventory and supply chain, amongst the other things. But I think it's a get ready, and we know that there's probably going to be a lot of this arriving in the second half of the year, and thinking about how you're going to manage that or approach that, it seems to be sensible to do at the moment. Sorry, we haven't got more detail on everything yet. Time to go back to you for an audience poll, and I hope we can do this. Which of the following, if any, is likely to be the main issue you'll need information and guidance on in the run-up to December 31st? This is in part to help us plan, where the balance of information is. So the choice here is regulation. By that, I broadly mean medicines regulation, MHRA matters, EMA matters. Borders and customs is slightly different. It's HMRC and moving your goods and things around. People and immigration, obviously, is people. Home office processes. Intellectual property, I think, stands for itself and is an important set of issues that fall within a slightly different part of the negotiations. And funding programs and how we get money. We've had a lot of discussion about Horizon Europe or British Business Bank or Innovate UK. So some of those things, how they might work, how they might change. I'm going to give you a few more minutes on this.
There's no other option, is there, Steve? But if people have got issues that aren't on that list that they're interested in hearing about or getting some thoughts on in future webinars, just drop it into the comments box or the questions box.
Yeah, questions, and we'll try and pick it up. So thank you. We've had a minute on that. So your position on this is 67% regulation, 17% borders, 3% people, 3% IP, and 10% funding programs. So we've taken a note. So thank you, Reg, obviously sitting high amongst this group, but others are interested. And I hope we can now move that on, and you can see the next poll. We're sort of trying to get a sense as to when you want to do this. I don't know if everyone is busy over the Easter season, would like to see us in April, or whether you're thinking this is done. We don't want to do it ever again. We're trying to get a sense as to industry need and sense on this, and also when there's something sensible to be said. So when would you like us to host the next trade webinar? Choice: April, May, June, never. We'll go keep this open for a few minutes. Thank you for those of you who are voting. It doesn't look like we're out of a job, I have to say, quite yet. But last 3 seconds, so we'll show you the result here. The result shows 26% say April, 51% say May, 22% say June. Nobody's yet said never. So thank you. I think that concludes what we were going to say, and then we'll go to some questions and chat. So I'm going to open up the questions box and see if there's anything that people are keen for us to comment on. Give me a moment whilst we find our way through this. What's the stance on R&D? Good question. So I think we've just seen this week's and a minister after the reshuffle be appointed to having the science brief. There is talk in the negotiating mandate of endeavouring to do some form of science deal. Sorry, we haven't majored on that in this deck. The nature and scope of that is unclear, but I'm imagining that the EU has various schemes in which you can pay to play, but therefore participate but not lead, and I think that's probably the sense in which we are imagining it might go. But again, not seen that much, and we haven't, because we focused on some other bits first. We haven't dug into that, nor have we seen significant engagement with it. Michael, I don't know if you've focused on that one at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a lot we can unpack in that question. We don't have a huge amount of time. I mean, the government's still fully committed to its 2.4% target. So that's good to hear. Yeah, some debate about where it sits in terms of a ministerial portfolio, but I think that's firming up. I mean, and strong commitments from our sector's point of view in terms of, reconfirming what's written in the life sciences industrial strategy about the UK being one of the best places in the world, or the best place in the world, to undertake R&D activities. I don't think we've got any recent cause for concern on that front. Of course, the thing that's the big thing, the big unknown is, what is that relationship with Europe in future, given that a large amount of the R&D activity that's currently underway is cross-border. So how are clinical trials going to operate, post the end of the year, Steve? That's one of the big unknowns at this stage. We've had the right kind of language on the government on this so far, but it really comes down to the substance of the deal that's done, I would say.
Okay, another point here. UK government has claimed that the non-inclusion of a pharma annex in the EU mandate suggests the EU starting point is not to accept mutual recognition agreements on regulatory elements. Is this fair? How much significance do we place on the fact that there is not an EU pharma annex? Good question. The honest answer is I haven't thought through that question.
Well, I would say, Steve, I mean, look, the point is we don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, what we can say is we can speculate that, the EU, it's as much as anything, this is a question of process on the EU side. They've been very clear they want a single agreement with single governance, that they're just not attracted to this model of kind of bolt-on options. So it didn't lend itself to that from their point of view. I'm not sure I personally would see that as a major cause for concern at this stage. What you can see at the kind of the philosophical level, what the EU are saying is they want a deep and ambitious deal, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that they haven't written in this annex in the way that we have it. Look, the point is, the reason why we've got that annex is because we and other members of the BIA and our industry lobbied hard into the UK government to have that annex. That's why it appears in our mandate for large part. The EU one didn't lend itself to that type of approach, but that doesn't mean to say the EU isn't looking for an ambitious deal. The area that we're concerned about on this is that the EU would say that ambitious, deep partnership in future is contingent on its red lines on the UK signing up to some quite tough conditions that it's not minded to sign up to. But I'm not sure that absence of an annex is something that should specifically worry us at this stage. And we'll certainly be engaging via our friends and partners in the EU to see where they sit and how they view that ask over the coming weeks as we head into the more detailed elements of the negotiations.
Thank you. I think it's, we don't know, and we'll keep it under review. Given the government's stance on Europe, does it still make sense for the EU to maintain its close alignment policy? Outside of the EU, there may be things that can be done unilaterally that would benefit our sector. Should we start to look at some of the advantages not being aligned, such as exploring whether the MHRA could accept regulatory dossiers in either EMA or FDA formats? I think this is a sensible point. I mean, I think the battle for Plan A is over. That's what you asked me to do, and that's what I endeavoured to do, and we got quite a long way, and I think as a result of having that, it's also been the opener for ensuring that the minimal viable options of some of the things that we see in the UK mandate in the annex are also part of the UK annex. I think we are turning our minds to the new future. I'll look to do that with members, and this is the type of thinking that's coming. I think that you saw my cost benefit analysis, or is this improving stuff slide, which is how we're thinking about trade deals. And then I think there is a pragmatic approach that I think the MHRA are keen to do about being an innovative regulator. I think that has to be linked to, for our world with SMEs, about whether there is support for SMEs in being able to access the regulator in the same way as we see from the EU, who obviously subsidise some of the innovation offerings to SMEs. We've not yet captured that in a future vision of the MHRA, but I think now's the time to have that discussion. When do we expect to get details on the annex of medicinal products? The published annex has the annex as it is. I don't expect to see anything in addition to that, Michael.
No, I don't think we would see any extra details published. I mean, if you've got any specific questions on that, do let us know. I mean, we're having regular dialogue with government officials on this stuff, so we can maybe kind of get some clarification if necessary on specific points if you want it. I mean, the other thing to say is, of course, it all comes down to when this is covered in the negotiations and what those negotiations add up to. We're not sure exactly when we might get to that. Probably, I think the hint is that maybe it'll be in the third round of negotiations. They might get into the details of the technical barriers to trade, which is where that annex stuff might come up. So you saw before the slide that we had in terms of the timetable. That's about the point that we might see more detail if we're going to get it.
So I think we realise it has to go through a negotiation. It's then got to come out the other side, and it's then got to. My sense is that it's not agreed till everything's agreed anyway. So
round 3 is April. So
yeah,
maybe let's revisit it at that webinar.
Yeah. Okay. The government has put forward a consultation on the medicines legislation, includes a proposal for the UK falsified medicine scheme. Do we have any further details on this? Obviously, we've followed the introduction of the medicines and medical devices bill, which was launched in Parliament. We could have put it as a separate slide. We haven't done here. In a sense, it's a piece of enabling legislation that enables the MHRA to have the power to do what it needs to do for next year. I think the question as to how it operationalises the powers it can take from that bill, which we think will go through Parliament, because it looks like the oppositions aren't going to oppose it and the Lords aren't going to won't get in the way of a majority government. So I think the bill will go through. I think this will come down to a question as to how and what do they choose to operate, and that in a sense will depend a little bit on what comes out in the negotiations. So I don't think we know the answer to that, but it gives me a good opportunity to plug what I hope will be a useful event for people on this webinar. We're confirming a joint conference with the MHRA for the middle of the year. We're looking at early July. I think we've got a date. I want to say the 3rd or the 4th of July, but I'm not sure. I think we are looking at the beginning of July to have a joint conference with the MHRA, and I think that some of these points which are here are useful for us in thinking about what agendas you might like. So what would the future of the MHRA look like if it's not inside the EU system? What will it do through reliance? What will it do through work sharing? Who will it rely on? What will that work sharing look like? What will it look to be preeminent in the world in? How will it operate things like falsified medicines? I think all of those issues are ones that are front and centre for us, and given the focus that's needed on regulatory issues from this group, I think that's where we'll be driving with my colleague Christiane Abuzaid, Michael, myself, into thinking that, and we'll be guided by our regulatory affairs experts in how we can help with some of the detail on that.
So just a quick notice on that, Steve. The government is, because you said this is enabling legislation, what we've heard from government is that they're going to consult separately on any secondary legislation that falls under the bill. So specifically things like FMD, sort of replacement scheme, we'd expect that to come back with more detail and the opportunity to comment on that in due course, is what they've said.
Excellent. So chances will come, and we'll keep people in contact with these processes via newscast and via our regular streams. With that, I've kept you here for nearly an hour. I hope you found it useful. We've not seen many people dropping off, so that's obviously been good. Unless there's any other questions, I would like to thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you found it useful. Feedback is always useful for us. Do drop us an email, sbates@bioindustry.org. We will be scheduling more of these. Do look on the website or get newscast, and that's how we'll let you know we left it a bit to here to see how people wanted it in terms of time frame, but I'm thinking sometime late April, early May, maybe where we go to, perhaps just the other side of Easter. So thank you very much. Hope it's been useful, and please keep in contact with us as this continues. Thank you.
Cheers.